Look at me being a good YouTuber, alright? I'm using my computer screen as like the appropriate thing even though I'm covering it up half the time. Hey camera, focus on me, focus on me, focus on me, focus on me. What if I can just do autofocus? Do you know like a smart YouTuber does? Autofocus instead of manual focus? Anyways, welcome all horror fans and vampire enthusiasts. So glad you can join me on a video that probably is a little bit too random and a little bit too niche. I don't care, I'm making the video anyways. Hi, my name is Sphinx and my special interest is vampires and vampire lore. I'm also someone who practices modern vampirism, so I'm kind of in the world of vampires and shit. I know what I'm talking about most of the time. Today, we're going to be talking about vampires in space. Yes, you heard me right. Vampires in space. Now again, this might seem like a really random, niche topic, vampires in the sci-fi genre, but it's actually a pretty common trope that I've realized as someone who explores vampire media a lot. The earliest example of this sci-fi vampire trope I could find was I Am Legend, written in 1954 by Richard Matheson. Probably said that wrong. I don't know. I'm gonna be looking up a lot of fancy words later in this script, so. I do know a lot of people have seen the Will Smith movie I Am Legend, which is based on the book I Am Legend, and will argue that this is a zombie movie and not a vampire movie. But in my research, I Am Legend popped up to be a vampire movie, so we're going to, for our reasons, going to put it into the vampire genre. From there on, we see more sci-fi vampires. Some well-known, some not so well-known, some good, some questionable. Either way, sci-fi vampires is a thing. But then the question comes to us, why is this a common trope? Why is this seen in media so often? Well, like most vampire lore and vampire portrayal in media, it unfortunately revolves around xenophobia, racism, and of course, communism. That's not a joke, by the way. That was like a rabbit hole I didn't expect to go down. Like, that's the thing we're gonna discuss in this video. Later, though. Let's do some horror history first. So we start to see sci-fi vampires pop up around the late 1950s and early 1960s. So in order to understand where that came from, we need to understand where the actual horror genre was at the time. So the 1950s was a pretty eventful time, obviously. There was the end of World War II and then the height of the Cold War. The American people at the time really wanted to go back to a more simple, traditional life due to the intensity and horrors of World War II and the political tension of nuclear war and the space race and just general Cold War stuff. So America wasn't really hyped about horror genres all that often because they had already experienced so much horror in real life. Though horror wasn't popular in the 1950s in media, horror comics were pretty popular, specifically among the youth and stuff like that. The comics that I'm talking about that were like the main popular ones were the Tales from the Crypt and the Vault of Horror. But, like many other things that portray violence and horror and tense situations, and was very popular among the youth, it was blamed for a lot of things. It was also being sued, you know, like video games, and literally any other violent media that we happen to see in our life. To be fair, there were like a few cases of kids going out into graveyards with makeshift weapons and looking for ghosts and monsters. But that's kind of just what kids do. I don't really know if that was a big impact. I don't know if the comics really influenced much of that action. I think that's just what kids do. So obviously, 1950s studios at the time were not thrilled or very excited to produce horror because it wasn't being well received by the everyday people. Which meant that horror was being produced and made and mostly watched by your outcasts, your misfits, your people who may not fit in with the everyday crowd. This once again proves my point that horror and the alternative community have always gone hand in hand. Even with all this tension and dislike for the horror genre, we still know there were 1950s horrors happening. So what were these horror medias? There were a couple factors that leaned towards storytelling of the 1950s horror. There was advanced technology, there was nuclear war / waste, there were invaders, and there was an abrupt change to everyday society. Those were their main factors of what told a good horror story in the 1950s. So these flicks were obviously mostly creature features and alien invaders. And of course, just the general sci-fi horror thing happening. Again, this is during the Cold War. We're advancing in technology and we're traveling space. Mostly. Now let's go ahead, since we got our baseline for the 1950s, let's go ahead and jump to the 1960s and what their horror genre was about. The 1960s had a lot of changes happening in it, and so that kind of reflected in the media. People were starting to question the traditional values and like this safety and blissful ignorance of just letting your government do whatever it wants. So of course this got people more engaged in politics, so this led to the civil rights movement, this led to people being against the war, because this is also the Vietnam War was happening at the time. Labor unions were rising back up and saying, hey, pay us what we need and give us, you know, working environments that don't kill us. Young people at the time were starting to fight against oppressive forces, and as well, another impactful thing in the 1960s was the fact that sex was becoming a little bit safer due to an advancement in technology, so you could explore your sex and your sexuality freely in a more safer way. The 60s was a time of change, but unfortunately horror at the time wasn't really quite preaching that story. Horror was still kind of giving the cautionary tale of don't break traditional values or bad things will happen. And maybe that would have worked. Maybe that would have stuck into people's mind. I mean, scare tactics work really well, unfortunately. But the 1960s also did something that was interesting. Their censorship laws were laxed. A lot. Before the 1960s, you couldn't even have couples in the same bed as each other. All violence had to be off-screen. And if you wanted any bit of nudity, no. You were getting none of that. The 1960s had a little bit more fun with their movie making, because now they didn't have to worry about so much censorship. And the generation that had grown up on horror movies was kind of getting bored of the whole monsters in rubber suits coming out of water and scaring people and stealing damsels in distress. So creature features were kind of dying out, and what was rising up is psychological thrillers. Horror was more centered around reality, because what's more scary than the world around you? I mean, they're literally seeing a war happening around them, and they're seeing the horrors of humanity and the depravity that can happen around them at all times. And who doesn't love a good ghost story? There was nothing else on that. Mostly it was just psychological thrillers. You scared the living shit out of me. Now that we kind of got our brief history on the 1950s horror genre, which revolved around advancing technology and aliens and sci-fi and nuclear war, now leading into the 1960s, which led on more psychological thrillers that had more shock value and gore in it, a little bit more nudity, a little bit more sex in it. Let's go ahead and talk about the other half of this video. Vampires. Just like technology at the time, 1950s vampires were changing and developing into something completely new. Before the 1950s, vampires were more spiritual. They were more demons haunting man or possessing man and wandering the earth looking for blood. There was a more religious folklore tied to it. But in the 1950s, that kind of changed. You remember how I mentioned in the 1950s one of the main factors of the horror genre at the time was nuclear war and waste? Well, that was because they were worried about what the effects of it were. We knew that it made people sick, but what if it made people really sick? So then it caused people to fear disease and new plagues and things that could infect a human and change them to things that weren't human. You see where I'm going with this? Vampires were no longer considered ghosts or demons or being possessed. They were diseased humans. Examples of this are, once again, I Am Legend and Curse of the Undead. Again, both those movies can be argued to be zombie movies, but at this point, my research showed that these were vampire movies, so we're using them as vampire movies. Fight about it in the comments, I don't care. And we do still see this in modern media, where vampires will give you a drop of their blood, or they'll exchange a human blood for their blood, and you will get the vampire disease, or the infection of vampirism, stuff like that. So it is a thing that we still use, and it kind of makes sense in the trope. Or, like the movie that I watched that led me down this rabbit hole, they're just aliens. Vampires are just aliens. I don't really have an explanation for that. Vampires are just aliens, alright? Now the 60s, of course, took a different route with vampires. As I mentioned before, sex was becoming a more common thing and was becoming a more explorational thing. Vampires, if you didn't know, have always been tied to sex and sexual exploration. Usually in a negative way. But they're still tied to sex. Some examples of this are, I gotta get my phone for this because I'm not gonna remember how to say any of these fucking names. In Japanese folklore, the Rokyo Kubi, who is a woman who was unfaithful to her husband in life, and then later turned into this vampire seductress. Then we have the Estrellas, who is a succubus in Jewish folklore. And of course we have the Babasith, who is a female fairy, often tied to similarities to the succubus. So vampires and sex go hand in hand. So they explore that in their vampire media portrayal. Vampires are oftentimes sexual deviants, seeking out sexual pleasure and, in the end, manipulating and murdering people. Vampires are also associated with queerness. And so if what I said sounds familiar. So I know this was a lot of information kind of all at once and maybe seemed a little scattered, so I'm gonna try, again I have ADHD, try to put this and explain this in a way that's a little bit easier. So we're just gonna tie up some loose ends and let me just get to that part. So let's go ahead and do a quick checklist of what we learned. 1950s horror involved sci-fi, creature features, invaders, nuclear war, technology advancing, diseases, Cold War / anti-communism, we'll get back to that one, traditional family values, and horror was for outcasts or people who were ostracized from society. 1960s horror involved breaking traditional family norms, thrillers, psychological horror, blood, sex, societal changes, and was driven by the youth. Now let's see how vampires can tie into these checkpoints. Let's start off with the sci-fi element. Obviously, vampires are considered fantasy creatures, so how exactly do they tie into sci-fi? When most people think of sci-fi, we do think of space exploration and futurism. But is that really all sci-fi is? Sci-fi is a genre, again, coming from science fiction. So it just really means advancing technology or exploring things that we don't understand through a scientific lens. So it doesn't have to limit us to just aliens in space and time traveling. Because I think if we limit sci-fi to just that, then that's not going to allow a lot of creativity in the genre. And we have seen science explore things that may seem like they just don't fit into the scientific community. For example, we have seen this in history before. During the spiritualism movement, there was exploration into what happens to life after death through a scientific lens. And during the Renaissance, we saw philosophers and scientists explore religion and folkloric stories through science. So combining supernatural creatures and supernatural beings, and just the supernatural in general, with scientific exploration isn't too far of a stretch. So sci-fi and fantasy can go hand in hand pretty easily. Now that that's out of the way, let's talk about the big old elephant in the room. The xenophobia and racism. This is not an exaggeration, by the way. This is a common thing in literature that many people have pointed out, that vampires are often tied to a xenophobic idea and a racist ideology. We see this even in Bram Stoker's Dracula. He is a villainous creature who lives far outside of society, on the outskirts of everyday traditionalism, who once he mingles in with society only wishes to bring havoc and harm to the world around him, and even abducting and bringing harm to the women in the area. You see where it's going with this? And that's not the only example of that in literature, as we even see it in Carmilla. As someone who listened to the audiobook of Carmilla, there was one line that really stuck out to me. They were describing Carmilla's mom, and they described her as a dark woman. Again, you could say, oh, that was just them being, you know, poetic, that she was like dark and mysterious. No, not from what a lot of researchers have seen. They describe that she is a person of color. Carmilla's family and trope are people who travel around, and once Carmilla has found her way and snuck her way into this family, she ends up manipulating and pretty much taking away the innocence of our female protagonist in the book, and she only brings harm and destruction wherever she goes. She's an outsider. Dracula and Carmilla are both considered outsiders invading everyday society only to cause harm and destruction. You see where it's going? Do I need to keep talking about it, or do we understand? We good? Great. Let's go. Now, let's talk communism. So before Dracula was popularized, vampires and like the curse of becoming a vampire was mostly something poor people feared. Because what was the cause of people becoming vampires at the time? It was bad burials. It was people who were vengeful after death, people who didn't have fulfilling lives and thus would haunt the world around them in death. So why would a rich person have to worry about that? They have the money to have a proper burial. They have all their needs met in life. They really shouldn't have any vengeful needs in death. So vampirism was a poor person thing. But Dracula, as he is Count Dracula, was a rich man who was a vampire. And so the literature and media representation of vampires slowly started to lean towards more of a rich people in the hierarchy can become vampires as well. And this is where our boy Mark was reading French ghost stories one day and started connecting the dots and used examples of the capitalistic businessmen sucking the life out of the laboring class. And so the language of vampires and capitalism became very twined together. Now let's remember what time period we're at. That's right, the Cold War. That's right, the height of communism. So let me try and explain this one more time in the probably most insane way I can explain this. I'm going off script for this because I feel like my train of thought has to do this. So let's start from the beginning. 1950s had sci-fi. Why did we have sci-fi? Because advancing technology. Because the Cold War. What was a big factor in the Cold War? That's right, communism. What were people describing some capitalistic people like? That's right, vampires. And what was a common group of people that leaned more towards communism? That's right, the laboring class, aka the misfits, the outcasts, the youth, and people who wanted societal changes. This is the craziest rabbit hole I've gone down in a while. The reason that we have vampires in space, one of the main factors, is because communism. Don't know how to end this video. I don't know where to go with this information anymore. Alright, vampires and communism. Do all the dumb YouTube stuff.